Major funding for Hitting the Road is provided by Overstock.com.
Overstock.com has launched pet adoptions.
Every year, 8 million animals are placed into adoption centers across the United States.
Our pet adoptions bring homeless animals all together in one place,
allowing you to search using the technology that powers Overstock.com.
Additional funding provided by General Atomic Sciences Education Foundation, the Calm Foundation, Delta Solutions and Strategies, Gray Line of Colorado, Northrop Grumman, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
From Acrospire to Zymergy, we can barely contain ourselves. I'm Donna Vesey, your adventurista. Stick around because we are brewing up a fascinating episode.
I'm hitting the road again. Got adventure crawling under my skin. Going places that I've never been. I'm hitting the road. I'm hitting the road again. Gonna take along all of my friends. Living life like there's just no end. I'm hitting the road. Feeling better since I don't know when. I'm hitting the road.
Beer has a long and effervescent history. I began my quest to learn more about this ancient beverage at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, where Dr. Jeffrey Miller pours out the facts.
Beer goes back well before written history. The really neat thing about beer is, given the right circumstances, beer will pretty much make itself.
Really?
Yes. When early humans first started domesticating grains, barley was one of the things that they domesticated first. Most of it was used to make a porridge, a lot like oatmeal, and some of it was later baked into flatbreads like pita breads. And in a time when every calorie was really precious, you didn't just throw something out for being a little weird or a little funky, and so there was probably a bowl of bubbling barley gruel that somebody said, "It smells a little funny, but I think I'll take a taste anyhow." And it didn't taste so bad, and it made them feel funny in a good way, and I don't think it took them long to realize what they needed to do to get that feeling all the time.
The ingredients and process of Zymergy hasn't changed much over the millennia. I was able to see this process firsthand with Mike Bristol, founder and owner of the award-winning Bristol Brewing Company. What was the motivation for you to start brewing beer?
I love beer, I guess, is the short answer. Right after college, I moved to Florida, and it was kind of hard to get decent beer. It was harder to get decent beer back then anyway. And as I discovered these really great beers, some import beers, but then Fritz Maytag at Anchor Brewing in California. I mean, Anchor Steam was kind of one of the early beers here, Nevada Pale Ale. I mean, I discovered these and I thought, wow, you know, this is completely different than what we drank in college. And so I kind of became enamored with that, and then I started homebrewing just because in Florida it was kind of hard to get good beer. And I just fell in love with the process.
I'm headed to the Colorado State Capitol to meet Governor John Hickenlooper. He is the first brewer to occupy a state governorship since Sam Adams in 1793. So, did you start out as a home brewer?
Yeah, so I took a year off from college after my freshman year and worked turning an old sardine factory on the northern coast of Maine into an alternative school. And all the parents there, this is Washington County, Maine, almost right by Eastport, and they all homebrewed. And so they kind of taught me how to homebrew. When I came back to college, I kept homebrewing. So I loved the notion of making beer from scratch. I just thought it's like magic.
The first written recipe that we have is actually a recipe for ale. So that recipe comes from ancient Sumeria in the Fertile Crescent. That was written on a clay tablet, and that clay tablet is now in the collection of Yale University.
Beer is very simple and very complicated at the same time. I mean, as far as ingredients, you have barley, hops, water, and yeast. There's only 4 base ingredients in beer. Now there's some specialty beers that have some oddball stuff in there, but by and large it's 4 ingredients. Now where it becomes complicated is those 4 ingredients, the variables, the quantities, the varieties, the times, the temperatures, all of the science behind it can make it very complicated. But at a base level, 4 ingredients is pretty easy.
A barley water mixture will naturally ferment on its own. Barley has a fair amount of fermentable sugar in it, And yeast is everywhere in the atmosphere. It's on people's hands, it's in the atmosphere, and a lot of it collects in the cracks of these bowls that are used over and over again for fermentation. And so it's very, spontaneous ferments are very common in nature.
I loved Fritz Maytag, who was the savior of Agnew Brewing Company. And he said one time there were a bunch of us sitting around having dinner. He picked up a pint of beer that hadn't been filtered, hadn't been pasteurized. He looked at it with this deep love in his eyes, and he said, "Do you realize there are more yeast cells, living cells, in this pint of beer than have lived human beings in the history of Earth?" Really? I was like, wow. Now, then you drink all those poor yeast cells, right? It makes it seem somewhat barbaric, but I love that vision that it is a living, that beer is a living creation.
So the oldest consumer protection law in the world is the Reinheitsgebot. The Reinheitsgebot was formulated because in the 1500s there was a lot of poorly made beer and adulterated beer being sold as, quote, the real thing, unquote. And so Duke Wilhelm of Bavaria wanted to put a stop to this really poor quality beer being circulated. He wanted everything to be to a good standard and to a high quality. So he issued a rule that you could only make beer from barley, hops, and water. They were using a lot of other things to adulterate beer, potato peelings and cabbage leaves and all kinds of unsavory things, and he knew this was ruining the reputation of Bavarian beer. So in 1516, he said only barley, hops, and water. Later, that was amended to include yeast. Originally, they got yeast naturally from the atmosphere. Later, when they figured out yeast and how to propagate it, they added that. But interestingly enough, the Reinheitsgebot is still in effect in a number of jurisdictions in Europe.
The first part of the process is you mill the barley. So we run the malted barley through a mill. And what we're trying to do there is not to pulverize it and make it into flour. We're just trying to expose the husk material. So we crush it enough so the husk material exposes the inside, because that's really what we're going to get at. From that point it goes into the mash tun, and in the mash tun it's mixed with hot water. So you mix it with hot water as it comes into the mash tun, and we want a very specific temperature, because when it gets into that mash tun there's a natural reaction that's going to happen, and it's going to happen kind of based on how we set up the temperature of the mash tun. So the enzymes that are already present in the malt convert the starches to sugars. So this conversion takes place slightly differently based on the temperature of that mash. So the temperature control is pretty key. The time that it spends in the mash is key, and in some cases we'll use different temperatures, so we'll keep it at one temperature for a little while, then go up to another one. So all of those variables shape how the character comes out at the end of the beer. And that process usually takes about, depending on the beer, it'll take about an hour. And at that point then we've got the conversion taking place, and now we want to get that liquid out. We want to get, it's referred to as wort at that point, W-O-R-T. So what we do is we run all of that mash from the mash kettle to the lauter tun. That's the other fun thing about this. We get all kinds of great terms like lauter tun. The European influence is there. So it goes to the lauter tun, and basically at that point it's you want to extract all that liquid out, kind of like steeping tea. You want to extract all that liquid out and leave the grain behind. And that's where that husk material really comes into play, because that husk material actually sets up a natural filter bed. And so the liquid comes out, and the husk material actually filters any particles from coming through. So that process takes about 90 minutes. Again, it depends on the beer, but that takes about 90 minutes. And you collect all that nice sugary liquid called wort, and we collect that into our boil kettle. And at that point, we bring it to a boil, and that's where the hops are added. So the hops get added during the boil, and they get added at different points during the boil. So some hops will go in at the beginning of the boil, and that really gets more of an intense kind of bitterness to balance that sweetness from the malt. And then we do hop additions later in the boil, so maybe at 45 minutes through or 55 minutes through. And those varieties give more hop character and more hop aroma. So you can start to see the number of variables involved, and that's why there's so many different beers, and that's why they don't taste the same at all. So the amount of hops, the variety of hops that we put in the boil, when they're put in, how long we boil, all of this stuff has a lot of variables. Once we're done with the boil, the boil is basically extracted all those, we call it, they're isoalpha acids from the hops, and that's what gives that beautiful hop character, that floral, bitter, grassy, fruity, all of those characters come out of the hops. And so once we're done with that, then we want to separate the solids that have boiled. During the boil, we have solids. So you have the hop residues, you have proteins that have coagulated during the boil. So we want to separate those from the liquid, so we run it through what we call a whirlpool. And that's just a physical process. It goes in the whirlpool and rotates, and it's kind of like tea leaves. All the solids go to the center of the bottom, and then we draw that off from the side, so we leave all that behind. And then at that point, it's going to go to fermentation, so we want to cool it. We're just below boil temperature at that point. So we want to cool it down, so we run it through a heat exchanger to cool it down. We inject air into the flow, because the first thing the yeast wants to do at fermentation is to take up the oxygen. So it needs to have oxygen in the wort at that point. So it goes through the heat exchanger, oxygen, air is injected into it, then it goes to the fermentation tank. We'll already have the yeast in the fermentation tank, so as it comes in, it mixes with the yeast. And again, this is another process that's happening entirely naturally. It's just that we're giving it the environment. We're giving it the right amount of yeast, the right amount of oxygen, and the correct temperature for the profile that we want. So that fermentation tank is set at a particular fermentation temperature. That's defined by the style of beer and the yeast. So as it goes in there, again, we like to take credit for brewing, but it's doing the job at that point. We've just given it the environment. The yeast basically consumes the sugars. That's its job. Consumes the sugars, and the byproduct of that is alcohol on one side, CO2 on the other side, and then of course during that process all the flavors are developed from that process. So depending on the yeast in the beer, that can take 5 days to 3 weeks for that actual fermentation process. And you can see the CO2 being generated from that process as it bubbles through our airlocks. We have these buckets, and you can see the air or the CO2 coming through the bubbling out. And for home brewers, it's exactly the same thing as a little airlock on a homebrew setup. And the only reason we use that is so that once it's done fermenting, you don't have any potential contamination getting back up into the tank. It just acts as an airlock. So we have to be patient during that point. We let the fermentation go. We know from each yeast and each beer kind of how long that's going to take, but we monitor it every day by taking a reading of specific gravity, which tells us that the sugar content is coming down. And we know where that should end. And then at that point, the yeast has kind of done its job. It's consumed all the sugar, so it starts to get tired and it starts to go dormant. We drop the temperature in the tank. Each tank has individual temperature control. So we drop that temperature in the tank, and the yeast pretty much goes dormant and goes to the bottom of the tank. And you can see on these tanks, they all have these cone bottoms, and that allows the yeast to go to the bottom, go to the very bottom, and then we can crop that yeast from underneath the beer to the next tank for another batch of beer. So as long as we're using the same yeast strain, that yeast gets moved from tank to tank for a certain number of generations, and then we'll bring it up in the lab again. So the yeast is really, I mean, keeping the yeast happy is a key part of the process, and we have a quality control lab, and we have a lot of temperature control and monitoring to make sure that our yeast is happy. That's really, if our yeast is happy, then the beer comes out great.
Then the beer is happy.
Exactly, and then the customers are happy.
Exactly.
We're all happy. So after we cool it down in the fermentation, it goes through a short aging process, and that again depends on the style of beer. Some beers only age for a few days in that tank. Certain beer styles might age up to 3 or 4 months. So again, that kind of depends on the style of beer. And we usually do that at a cooler temperature. That allows any yeast that's still in suspension to drop out, allows those flavors to meld in the tank until we get that character that we're looking for that particular beer style. And at that point, the beer could be ready to drink, but in most cases, we'll run it through our centrifuge, which basically, we used to use a filter, and a lot of breweries use a filter. We like the centrifuge better because it gently spins the beer and takes the yeast out just by physics. It basically goes to the outer part, dumps the yeast, and the nice clear beer then goes on to our final product tanks. And it's a very gentle system, and it really does wonderful things for the beer. Now, certain beers we want them to be cloudy. A lot of wheat beers traditionally are cloudy. That wheat beer yeast actually adds some character to the beer. So some beers we won't run through the centrifuge at all. Some will run through, but we'll run through fast enough that it doesn't take all the yeast out. So again, there's a variable there that depending on the style of beer that we want. But for a lot of beers, people expect, and I do too, you expect to look at it and look through it and see a really nice, clear, beautiful beer. I mean, if it's done right, to me, it's like art. So at that point, the beers, it goes to what we call our bright beer tank, which is really a finished product tank, but bright beer is a lot more fun to say. And the reason it's bright is because it's already been filtered, so now it's considered bright. So we touch up the carbonation in there. Some of the carbonation happened in the fermentation tank, but we touch up the carbonation in the bright tank so we have good, consistent carbonation. And then from the bright tank, it goes into the final package. So it will either go into our bottling line or it'll go to our keg line.
It's interesting, in the history of making beer, women were actually the primary beer makers until very recent times. When beer making was a domestic industry, the division of labor was generally men went out and worked in the fields and women stayed home and did things around the house. And one of the things that they did around the house was make beer for the family. If they wanted to make a little extra money for things they needed or to barter for something they needed, they tried to make a little extra beer. And so women were the primary beer makers really until the big monastic revolution of the Middle Ages. And then the monks and the abbesses started to make beer as a way to make money for their abbeys and their monasteries. And it stays a pretty much domestic occupation until the invention of the steam engine, which really signals the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. At that point, beer making becomes an industrial process, and that's when the guys take over the process.
Is Colorado known as the beer state?
Well, Colorado is the beeriest state in America, and I think we always called it, when I started the Wine Coop, after we started getting going, we saw all these other brewers opening their own breweries. We started calling it the Napa Valley of beer. It's Colorado, and then that, of course, makes Denver the Munich of the West.
So what kind of economic impact do all of these breweries have on the state of Colorado?
Oh, I think it's amazing. I think we're now up at the point where they're saying it's around 10,000 employees, all told, between direct and indirect. So you got distributors, you got these little liquor stores that depend on the brewers.
Beer is really critical through history because of the three main beverages that people had: beer, water, and milk. Beer was by far the safest one to drink. Anytime you were in some kind of settlement, one of the things that people did right away was foul their own water supply. Outhouses would leach into water tables, people would dump things in rivers and lakes, and so water became fouled pretty easily. Milk was not a good bet to drink because people hadn't discovered pasteurization yet. And there's a lot of diseases that lurk in raw milk, especially in an era where sanitation is not very good. And so what's safe to drink is beer because we boil the water when we make beer. And so people learned very early on that beer was the safest thing to drink. In the instance of the Pilgrims, they had water barrels on board and beer barrels on board. The water in the barrels went bad faster than the beer in the barrels. And so by the time they got to America, the water was not good to drink. And so they were relying on the beer to be a safe beverage to drink. And through history, beer was one of the safest things that people could drink. So it became not just a luxury, but a necessity of life.
What's your favorite beer?
Well, the short answer is my favorite beer is the one in my hand, but I don't really have a favorite beer. I really like seasonal beers. I love the romance and the tradition, and it's very historical. Certain beers were brewed at particular times of year, partly because they didn't have the technology that we have now, and so refrigeration and those kind of things were very difficult. So certain beers happen during certain times of year out of necessity.
What's your favorite beer?
Oh, that depends on the time of the year, and I always say that my favorite beer is the local beer. I mean, I think beer it's important. I tell people this all the time. Beer is food. A good Bordeaux will get better with age. Beer needs to age for about 60 days, 30 to 60 days to be at its absolute peak, and then it'll keep for a while, but it doesn't continue getting better. And I look at depending on the season and where I am, I have all kinds of favorite beers.
So what is the most fascinating thing about beer besides the yeast cells?
Well, one of the things I loved is, especially with craft beer, is you get that relationship you have when people say break bread with people, but they really mean eating, drinking, spending the time around food and beverage with people. And I think that's what I love is the different ways you get to know people. And it's funny, at one beer, I think most people, their inhibitions come down a little bit, and they're willing to talk to a stranger or willing to reveal to someone they'd met, an hour ago. They're willing to, expose themselves a little bit more than they otherwise might. And I think that's part of the magic of beer. And beer, craft beer, it costs more, so you're not going to drink too much. Plus, after you have a couple, 2 or 3 beers, you're not going to be able to have that relationship. And when we designed the wine coupe, Willis Berzens, who was my restaurant designer, is a genius. He put the bar stools pretty close to where the tables were along the windows. And I said, well, Willis, aren't people going to bump into each other? And he said, yeah, that's the idea. That's what we designers call friendly friction. And when people bump into each other in a crowded restaurant or a crowded bar, they're more likely to talk to a stranger, especially if they've had, a half a pint of beer, which I think that's the part of the magic. We used to promote our competitors in lower downtown Denver, right? So we first opened, our rent was $1 a square foot per year. I mean, no one had opened a brew pub or a restaurant of any kind down there in 5 years. And we wanted to get people to come there, so we put up little signs in our vestibule for some of our competitors. And my employees came and said, Hickenlooper, you are a nitwit. This is a dog-eat-dog world. You can't promote the competition. I said, well, maybe our real competition isn't the other restaurants, but our real competition is the TV set. And our job is to get people off the seat, out the door, enjoy life with their family and friends. If we do a good enough job and our competitors do a good job, more people will go out more often and more people will come to lower downtown, to Lodo. And my employees looked so skeptical, and yet in the end there were, 30 restaurants in the downtown area when we first opened, and now they're over 350. So something happened.
Beer creates community.
Well, we worked real hard with all the other restaurants down there. So first it was just us unilaterally putting up signs, but then we reached out and said, can we go buy pint glasses together? Let's all of us in a group take out an ad for Lodo to encourage people to come down here, to whichever restaurant they go to. And we really did want to create community. And there were 3 or 4 of us developers, young guys, that when we had these big warehouses, at Wine Coupe, when we expanded, we put a giant 12,000 square foot pool hall on the second floor. But then we did lofts on the top 3 floors because we wanted people to walk to work. We wanted to reinvent the downtown. We wanted to use this historic district as a way to create community. And having a craft manufacturing plant, it's not really a plant, but it's like a bakery. And having that as kind of the fulcrum by which people got to know each other really did help create community.
So beyond the love of beer, what else does beer represent in a community as a culture?
I think the way beer has become part of the culture in the U.S., particularly Colorado, but also in the U.S., has been very interesting to me, and I think we're excited to have been a part of that. But if you look back over kind of the history of these breweries, you see a lot of really great examples of not just a brewery opening up, but a brewery opening up. Wine Coupe is a good example. I mean, when Wine Coupe opened in what is now Lodo, it was a scary place to go at night. It was not what it is now. And so you had these entrepreneurs that had this passion for beer, and they opened up in these places, and I don't even know that it was necessarily planned, but people rallied around this concept. They rallied around the independents, they rallied around these passionate entrepreneurs and these places. And so we're an example of that as well. I mean, we opened up in this closed elementary school 3 years ago, and it's really been interesting to see the enthusiasm and the excitement in this neighborhood and the culture that sort of comes around it. It's a gathering place. So it's not just about the beer. It's about gathering. It's about community, seeing your neighbors. Our goal, and I stole this from somebody else, I can't remember. I think it might have been John Hickenlooper actually, is in our business, we're not competing with the other breweries. We're competing with the TV, we're competing with the couch, and now we're competing with the internet. So if we can get people off the couch and out communicating with each other over a beer, great things happen. The dialogue is what's important, and it's a different dialogue sitting across the table from somebody in a neat old building, drinking a great beer, than it is sniping at each other through social media or through the comment section of whatever website. And I think that's been important, and you see that throughout the state and throughout the country, really, where breweries have not just made an impact on jobs and been able to make their beer, but they've made a big impact on the community at large, either their neighborhood or their city. And that's been exciting for us, and we're very proud to have kind of been a part of that.
I'm hitting the road again. Got adventure crawling under my skin. Going places that I've never been. I'm hitting the road. I'm hitting the road again. Gonna take along all of my friends. Living life like there's just no end. I'm hitting the road. Feeling better since I don't know when. I'm hitting the road.
If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future shows, drop us a line at info@hittingtheroadtv.com. Major funding for Hitting the Road is provided by Overstock.com.
Overstock.com has launched pet adoptions.
Every year, 8 million animals are placed into adoption centers across the United States,
Our pet adoptions bring homeless animals all together in one place.
allowing you to search using the technology that powers Overstock.com.
Additional funding provided by General Atomic Sciences Education Foundation, the Calm Foundation, Delta Solutions and Strategies, Gray Line of Colorado, Northrop Grumman, and by viewers like you. Thank you.